The Mau Mau Uprising, Kenya, 1952 to 1960. Land, freedom, and the violence of empire. Before colonialism, the pre-colonial world. Long before the name Kenya appeared on European maps, the region existed not as a single political entity, but as a dense and dynamic human landscape. The lands surrounding Mount Kenya, the Rift Valley, Lake Victoria, and the Indian Ocean coast were home to a mosaic of societies, each structured, adaptive, and deeply organized. The agricultural Kikuyu cultivated the fertile Central Highlands. The Maasai moved across the Rift Valley in patterns shaped by pastoral mobility. Luo communities flourished along Lake Victoria, while Kalenjin-speaking groups occupied the Western Highlands. Along Mount Kenya's eastern slopes, the Mbu and Meru developed their own territorial and social systems. On the coast, Swahili city-states connected East Africa to the wider Indian Ocean world. These were not tribes in the rigid categories later imposed by colonial rule. They were political and economic communities governed by systems of order, societies with mechanisms of authority, diplomacy, economic specialization, and spiritual legitimacy. Pre-colonial East Africa was not a wilderness awaiting governance. It was a region of systems. Land, for instance, was regulated through deeply embedded social frameworks. Among pastoral societies like the Maasai, territory functioned through negotiated mobility rather than fixed ownership. Among agricultural communities such as the Kikuyu, land was lineage-anchored, socially defined, and inseparable from identity. Ownership, in the European sense of individualized property, was largely alien. Territory defined survival, but rights were relational rather than purely personal. Economic life was equally interconnected. Coastal merchants traded across the Indian Ocean, while goods, ivory, livestock, grains, iron tools, moved along inland networks that linked distant communities. Isolation was the exception, not the norm. Conflict, too, followed structure rather than chaos. Alliances formed, grazing rights were negotiated, intermarriage reinforced diplomacy, and warfare itself was governed by norms. Violence existed, but it was bounded by rules and expectations. Underlying these systems were spiritual institutions that fused governance, morality, and land. Sacred groves, ancestral authority, ritual specialists, and oath traditions anchored political legitimacy. Power did not rest solely on force. It rested on cosmology. Within this landscape, the Kikuyu world would later become central to the Mau Mau story, because for the Kikuyu, land was not merely economic terrain. It was existence itself. Land sustained agriculture and therefore survival. It defined lineage and therefore belonging. Most critically, it linked the living, the ancestors, and the unborn. Territory was inherited not simply through law, but through memory and ritual continuity. European observers frequently misunderstood Kikuyu tenure precisely because it did not resemble Western private property. Land was lineage-based, morally charged, and held across generations. It was custodianship rather than possession, continuity rather than commodity. This distinction would later become catastrophic. When colonial rule introduced seizure, individualized titles, and settler ownership, the disruption was not administrative. It was civilizational. Within Kikuyu society, land formed the architecture of economy, identity, and ancestry. Remove land, and everything else destabilizes. What the British would later describe as rebellion, many Kikuyu experienced as existential defense. The struggle was not born in ideology. It was born in survival. The colonial shock, birth of British Kenya. The transformation of this world did not begin in Africa. It began in Europe. In the winter of 1884 to 1885, representatives of Europe's great powers gathered at the Berlin Conference. No African leaders attended. No African societies were consulted. Across polished tables, diplomats partitioned an entire continent into spheres of influence. Africa became geometry. For Britain, East Africa represented strategy, trade, and imperial competition. Claims drawn on paper would soon demand enforcement on the ground. Empire required infrastructure, soldiers, administrators, and mechanisms of extraction. By 1895, Britain formalized its authority through the British East Africa Protectorate. Railways followed. Military posts emerged. Administrative districts formed. New taxation and legal systems took shape. Colonial rule did not simply overlay existing African systems. It reordered them. At the center of British expansion stood the Uganda Railway, constructed between 1896 and 1901. Officially framed as a commercial and civilizing project, the railway functioned as an instrument of penetration and control. Railways are never neutral technologies. They reshape geography, economics, and power. With steel tracks came settlers. With settlers came irreversible change. In 1920, the Protectorate became the colony of Kenya, a legal shift that redefined the colonial project. Kenya was not merely administered. It was engineered as a settler colony. Settler colonies operate under a harsher logic than extraction colonies. They require permanent European occupation, which in turn requires permanent African dispossession. Large swaths of fertile highland territory were reclassified as crown land, a devastating legal fiction that erased ancestral claims. Occupation did not matter. Customary tenure did not matter. African legitimacy dissolved under European law. The most agriculturally valuable lands became the White Highlands, reserved almost exclusively for European settlers. Africans, particularly the Kikuyu, were pushed into native reserves, overcrowded, economically restrictive territories designed less for prosperity than containment. Colonial Kenya hardened into a society structured by racial hierarchy. Europeans occupied land, capital, and political authority. Africans increasingly became labor pools with restricted rights. For African communities, the shock was profound. Land without ancestry, law without tradition, authority without legitimacy. Displacement was not incidental. It was structural. And at the center of it all lay land, the axis upon which inequality, resentment, and future conflict would turn. The Mau Mau Uprising would not emerge from sudden rebellion. It would grow from decades of accumulated fracture, dispossession, economic compression, political exclusion, and psychological humiliation. The colonial state created the conditions. History would supply the explosion. The core conflict, land seizure. At the heart of colonial Kenya lay a single, explosive contradiction. Land, not ideology, not nationalism, not even race, at least not initially. Land defined wealth, survival, dignity, and political power. Colonial rule reordered all four. Through ordinances and administrative decrees, vast territories were declared crown land, transforming ancestral landscapes into settler property. Entire communities were displaced not through negotiation, but through law backed by force. For the Kikuyu, whose homeland lay directly within settler zones, the consequences were catastrophic. Loss of subsistence farming destabilized lineage continuity. Traditional inheritance systems fractured. Economic autonomy collapsed. Africans were relocated into native reserves that quickly became overcrowded and ecologically strained. By the 1940s, colonial Kenya had hardened into two sharply unequal economies. A small settler minority, roughly 30,000 Europeans, controlled millions of acres of prime land, key sectors of the economy, and political institutions. Meanwhile, African populations faced land scarcity, soil exhaustion, wage dependency, and mounting insecurity. Many displaced Africans became squatters on settler farms. In theory, squatters exchanged labor for residence. In practice, tenure was precarious, labor obligations expanded, and eviction threats remained constant. Colonial taxation systems deepened dependency. Hut taxes and poll taxes required cash payments, forcing Africans into wage labor. Economic participation became compulsion rather than choice. Beyond material deprivation lay psychological rupture. Men reduced from landholders to laborers. Families transformed from custodians to tenants. Communities redefined from sovereign actors to subjects. Land became political power itself. By the mid-20th century, tensions were no longer abstract. They were lived daily realities. A generation raised in dispossession confronted shrinking prospects and blocked mobility. European prosperity depended on African displacement. African survival required land restoration. These realities could not peacefully coexist. The Mau Mau Uprising would later be framed as terrorism or insurgency. Yet beneath every label lay the original fracture. The conflict was not born in the forests. It was born in the fields. Structural causes of the uprising. The uprising did not erupt suddenly. It accumulated. Land alienation destabilized livelihoods. Labor exploitation entrenched dependency. Political exclusion narrowed peaceful pathways. Institutionalized racial hierarchy eroded dignity. Each pressure alone was destabilizing. Together, they became combustible. The squatter crisis intensified insecurity. Harsh labor regulations constrained mobility. Moderate reform efforts stalled. Educated Africans encountered systemic barriers. Youth faced generational fracture. By the early 1950s, for many Africans, particularly among the Kikuyu, colonial rule no longer appeared merely unjust. It appeared unlivable. Violence became thinkable not because ideology demanded it, but because structural conditions made alternatives increasingly implausible. Rise of African nationalism. Before guerrilla warfare filled the forests, resistance first took shape in petitions, associations, newspapers, and political unions. The struggle began with words. Organizations like the Kikuyu Central Association articulated grievances rooted in land, taxation, and representation. Within this environment, Jomo Kenyatta emerged as a political bridge between Kenyan discontent and global nationalist discourse. Kenyatta's politics were initially constitutional and reformist. He advocated land justice, African representation, and gradual self-governance. Under his leadership, the Kenya African Union, KU, sought multi-ethnic mobilization and negotiated change. Yet colonial reluctance, settler influence, and stalled reforms narrowed political space. While KU pursued institutional pathways, underground currents intensified. Moderates sought reform. Radicals prepared for confrontation. The separation between KU and Mau Mau, though historically significant, became increasingly blurred within colonial security logic. As political avenues contracted, the colony moved toward rupture. Emergence of Mau Mau. Mau Mau did not appear in a single moment. It emerged quietly, through networks, rituals, and clandestine organization, primarily among Kikuyu, Mbu, and Meru communities, societies most directly affected by land alienation and economic compression. For many participants, Mau Mau represented restoration rather than rebellion. Its core ideology fused land and freedom into inseparable demands. Land symbolized survival and justice. Freedom represented escape from colonial hierarchy and recovery of dignity. The movement was neither a conventional nationalist party nor a simple ethnic revolt. It was a hybrid, anti-colonial resistance intertwined with social upheaval, generational tensions, and civil fracture. At its center stood a mechanism of extraordinary power. The oath. The oathing system, ritual, power, and resistance. Mau Mau lacked formal state institutions. It possessed instead something older and culturally potent. Oathing rituals that transformed political alignment into sacred obligation. Oaths were not inventions of the insurgency. They were embedded within Kikuyu social systems as instruments of trust, authority, and moral accountability. Mau Mau reactivated this moral technology under conditions of crisis. Through ritual, the movement bound secrecy, discipline, and loyalty. Allegiance became existential rather than contractual. Defection became desecration. Colonial authorities, viewing events through unfamiliar frameworks, interpreted oathing as barbaric fanaticism and evidence of terrorism. Participants experienced legitimacy and obligation. The clash over oaths revealed a deeper conflict. Empire governed through law and force. Mau Mau mobilized through belief and memory. Two systems of legitimacy collided, neither fully understanding the other. Key players, personalities in a structural war. The Mau Mau Uprising was born from structural tensions, land dispossession, political exclusion, economic pressure. Yet wars are never fought by structures alone. They are lived, interpreted, and shaped by individuals operating within those forces. Leaders, administrators, commanders, and settlers did not create the crisis, but each became an instrument through which history moved. Mau Mau itself did not begin as a conventional army. It emerged through clandestine networks, oath systems, and localized cells. But as confrontation intensified, the movement evolved. Leadership structures hardened, ranks appeared, and commanders rose not from military academies, but from lived colonial realities. Among them, no figure would become more emblematic than Dedan Kimathi. Kimathi's early life mirrored the contradictions of colonial Kenya. Mission-educated and briefly integrated into colonial institutions, he belonged to a generation exposed to European systems yet constrained by European hierarchy. Radicalization did not arise from abstract ideology. It grew from proximity to inequality, from witnessing the narrowing gap between promise and reality. Within the forests of the Aberdares and Mount Kenya, Kimathi emerged as both strategist and symbol. He understood what many insurgent leaders grasp in asymmetrical conflicts. Survival mattered more than spectacle. Mau Mau could not defeat Britain through conventional confrontation. It had to persist through mobility, decentralization, and psychological leverage. Guerrilla warfare became necessity rather than doctrine. Units moved fluidly. Engagements were selective. Visibility itself became tactical currency. Yet Kimathi's importance extended beyond military calculation. Insurgencies rely not only on weapons, but on belief. Kimathi became a morale anchor, a unifying presence, a living embodiment of defiance. Colonial authorities saw a fugitive insurgent destabilizing order. Supporters saw a defender of land, dignity, and historical continuity. Alongside Kimathi operated other commanders whose legacies, though less globally mythologized, were central to the movement's operational capacity. Stanley Methenge represented Mau Mau's evolving military discipline. Associated with forest-based command structures, Methenge helped organize fighting units and coordinate resistance under increasingly hostile conditions. His later disappearance, variously attributed to exile, death, or obscurity, reflects a recurring feature of insurgent wars: fragmented documentation and contested memory. Some leaders vanish into history not because they lacked influence, but because war erodes archival clarity. Warui Aidot, widely known as General China, embodied a different and deeply consequential trajectory. China rose as a respected field commander, known for organizational skill and battlefield effectiveness. But his capture in January 1954 marked a pivotal psychological rupture. Unlike many insurgent leaders who remained uncompromising, China later cooperated with colonial authorities, a decision that transformed him into one of the conflict's most controversial figures. To British officials, China became proof that Mau Mau could be penetrated, fractured, and rehabilitated. To many fighters, he became a symbol of betrayal. His story illuminated the brutal internal pressures of insurgency: coercion, survival, exhaustion, pragmatism, and moral ambiguity. Wars do not produce simple loyalties. They produce impossible choices. Opposing Mau Mau stood a colonial administration equally shaped by personalities, yet bound by imperial doctrine. Sir Evelyn Baring governed Kenya at the moment tension tipped into systemic conflict. His declaration of a state of emergency on October 20th, 1952, did more than respond to violence. It fundamentally redefined governance itself. Political unrest became securitized crisis. Civil administration became security administration. Under Baring's leadership, extraordinary measures hardened into policy: mass detentions, expanded executive authority, villagization programs, and legal restructuring. Within prevailing imperial assumptions, order required preservation, and authority could not appear fragile. Structural grievances, land, representation, economic inequality, became secondary to stability imperatives. Military escalation followed. General Sir George Erskine's appointment in 1953 marked the professionalization of Britain's counterinsurgency campaign. Erskine approached Kenya not as a policing challenge, but as a military theater requiring systemic containment. Intelligence operations intensified. Population control became central strategy. Surveillance infrastructure expanded. Territory mattered less than people. Separating civilians from insurgents, disrupting networks, and controlling movement became defining features of colonial doctrine. Mau Mau was framed as a military problem demanding comprehensive suppression. Yet beyond the battlefield and administrative chambers stood another powerful actor: the European settler community. Settler society was neither passive nor peripheral. Its prosperity depended directly on land security, particularly control of the fertile White Highlands. Mau Mau violence therefore struck not only at individuals, but at the economic foundation of settler existence. Fear reshaped politics. As attacks increased, settler anxiety deepened into narratives of existential threat. Perceptions of racialized danger intensified demands for harsher security responses. Through legislative influence, lobbying pressure, and institutional access, settlers reinforced hardline colonial policies. Moderation increasingly appeared untenable within a climate defined by insecurity. Thus, the conflict hardened. Yet, despite the prominence of individuals, the uprising cannot be reduced to heroic figures or administrative villains. Kimathi did not invent land alienation. Bering did not create imperial doctrine. Settlers did not design colonial hierarchy. But each became an instrument of larger forces: empire, dispossession, insurgency, fear, survival. Leadership, however, remained decisive. In asymmetrical wars, symbols sustain morale, commanders shape tactics, administrators structure repression, and narratives define legitimacy. The Mau Mau conflict unfolded not only through armed confrontation, but through perception, authority, belief, and psychological power. By late 1952, those pressures converged toward rupture. 1952, crisis point. By the closing months of 1952, colonial Kenya stood at a breaking point. What had simmered for decades, land dispossession, labor tensions, political exclusion, clandestine mobilization, now moved unmistakably into open confrontation. The colonial state no longer perceived unrest as fragmented dissent. It saw insurgency. Escalation did not originate from a single dramatic event. Rather, instability accumulated across central province. Assassinations increased. Loyalist chiefs became targets. Oathing networks expanded. Colonial intelligence reports grew steadily more alarmed. Fear spread through multiple layers of society. Administrators detected organized resistance. Settlers feared widespread rebellion. Security officials warned of coordinated insurgent structures. Whether fully accurate or amplified by anxiety, the perception hardened. Kenya was sliding toward systemic disorder. On October 20th, 1952, Governor Sir Evelyn Baring declared a state of emergency. The decision marked a profound transformation. Political unrest became legalized war. Extraordinary powers became normalized governance. Civil administration shifted decisively into security administration. Official rhetoric framed the emergency as a defensive necessity. Colonial authorities cited escalating violence, killings of loyalists, threats to settlers, and intelligence concerning secret oath societies. The measure was presented as stabilization, an act designed to restore order. Yet beneath the justification lay deeper anxieties. Land security, mass African mobilization, and colonial authority itself appeared increasingly vulnerable. Emergency powers were therefore not merely reactive. They were preventive, intended to crush a movement before it matured into something more structurally dangerous. The declaration triggered immediate action. Within hours, Operation Jock Scott unfolded as a pre-planned decapitation strike. Prominent African political leaders were arrested, including Jomo Kenyatta and senior Kenya African Union (KU) figures. The sweep extended beyond armed militants into political leadership, organizers, and suspected sympathizers. Distinctions blurred. KU was not Mau Mau, yet colonial policy increasingly treated constitutional nationalism and insurgency as intertwined threats. Moderate political space contracted abruptly. Simultaneously, Kenya entered rapid militarization. British Army units deployed alongside the King's African Rifles, expanded police forces, and armed settler auxiliaries. Security doctrine shifted toward sweeps, curfews, checkpoints, intelligence operations, and collective punishments. Control of territory became secondary. Control of population became central. Perhaps the most defining feature of emergency rule was the construction of a vast detention system. Tens of thousands of Africans were detained, many without conventional trials. Detention became administrative rather than judicial. Suspicion became sufficient grounds for incarceration. Officially, detention aimed to remove insurgents, extract intelligence, and rehabilitate detainees. In practice, it disrupted networks, isolated leadership, fractured communities, and enforced compliance. Camps, screening centers, work facilities, and rehabilitation institutions formed an expanding archipelago of containment. Entire populations came under surveillance and classification. For many Africans, emergency governance became inseparable from incarceration risk. Law itself transformed. Emergency powers granted authorities the ability to detain without trial, restrict movement, seize property, enforce curfews, and conduct sweeping searches. Exceptional authority gradually hardened into routine administration. Kenya was no longer governed conventionally. It was governed through permanent crisis logic. Moderate African politics collapsed under restriction and imprisonment. Daily life absorbed the rhythms of militarization, curfews, past checks, raids, detentions, surveillance. 1952 thus stands not as a simple administrative turning point, but as the moment the conflict fundamentally changed character. Before, tension, violence, underground mobilization. After, institutionalized war, mass repression, systemic counterinsurgency. Yet suppression carried paradox. Emergency rule stabilized colonial authority through overwhelming force, but intensified grievances, accelerated Mau Mau militarization, and eroded imperial legitimacy. Repression restored order, while deepening the struggle it sought to extinguish. The war had entered a new phase, and violence would soon escalate further. Early violence and escalation, 1952 to 1953. With the declaration of the emergency, violence no longer lingered in secrecy. It intensified, expanded, and hardened into recognizable patterns of insurgency. What had previously taken the form of intimidation, assassinations, and covert sabotage now evolved into systematic armed resistance. Yet the early targets of Mau Mau operations reveal something essential about the nature of the conflict. Contrary to later portrayals of indiscriminate violence, many initial attacks were highly selective. Loyalist Africans, colonial collaborators, government-aligned chiefs, and settler farms became central objectives. The logic was unmistakably political. Mau Mau was not simply striking at colonial authority. It was striking at the local structures that sustained colonial rule. The British system in Kenya depended heavily on African intermediaries. Chiefs, headmen, home guards, and informants formed the administrative spine of rural governance. They enforced regulations, gathered intelligence, and symbolized state authority within African communities. To the colonial state, these figures were indispensable. To Mau Mau fighters, they represented betrayal. Violence therefore became internalized. The war did not merely oppose Africans and empire. It began tearing through Kikuyu society itself, fracturing communities along lines of loyalty, coercion, survival, and fear. This internal rupture reached one of its most defining moments in March 1953. On March 26, Mau Mau fighters attacked the village of Lari, widely known as a loyalist stronghold. Homes were set ablaze. Residents were killed. Historical estimates commonly cite approximately 74 deaths. The victims overwhelmingly Kikuyu loyalists rather than Europeans or British officials. The massacre sent shockwaves through the colony. For colonial authorities, Lari became powerful propaganda. It was framed as proof of Mau Mau barbarity, reinforcing narratives that justified harsher repression. For many Africans, the event deepened fear and accelerated polarization. Neutrality became increasingly untenable in a landscape defined by suspicion and retaliation. British response was swift and severe. Security forces launched aggressive counter-operations. Villages were burned. Arrests multiplied. Collective punishments expanded. Violence escalated symmetrically, feeding a cycle in which insurgent attacks and state retaliation reinforced one another. By 1953, the conflict could no longer be understood as a simple colonial rebellion. It had become, in devastating measure, a civil war within Kikuyu society, neighbor against neighbor, family against family, loyalty against survival. This internal fracture would profoundly shape the trajectory of British counterinsurgency. British counterinsurgency, full imperial response. Britain did not interpret Mau Mau as a localized disturbance. It was treated as a systemic threat requiring comprehensive suppression. The response mobilized not merely colonial policing, but the full machinery of imperial control. Urban centers quickly emerged as strategic priorities. Nairobi, the colonial capital, occupied a particularly sensitive position. Authorities increasingly viewed the city as a logistical and intelligence hub for insurgent networks, a space where recruitment, coordination, and supply could flourish beyond rural surveillance structures. In April 1954, the colonial state launched Operation Anvil. The operation transformed Nairobi into a sealed security zone. Roadblocks appeared. Movement was halted. Entire neighborhoods were subjected to sweeping screening exercises. Approximately 20,000 Africans were detained, not through individualized judicial processes, but through mass classification mechanisms. The objective was clear and uncompromising: separate civilians from insurgents, dismantle urban support networks, and assert intelligence dominance. Operation Anvil marked a decisive shift. Counterinsurgency no longer focused solely on armed fighters. It targeted the social ecosystems within which insurgency could survive. The outcome was dramatic. Detention infrastructure expanded rapidly. Surveillance systems intensified. Nairobi itself became a laboratory of population control. What unfolded in the capital soon radiated outward across the colony. The detention system, society re-engineered. What began as targeted arrests evolved into a vast system of containment. Hundreds of thousands of Africans passed through detention camps, screening centers, work facilities, and controlled village schemes. Though precise figures remain historically debated, widely referenced estimates suggest that between 80,000 and 150,000 individuals were detained, while more than 1 million were subjected to villagization policies. These numbers underscore scale rather than statistical precision. This was not merely incarceration. It was mass social engineering. Villagization programs forcibly relocated rural populations into controlled settlements designed to sever insurgent supply lines, enable surveillance, and restrict mobility. Traditional social geographies, patterns of kinship, land use, and movement were systematically dismantled. Detention regimes extended beyond punishment. Many detainees entered systems of forced labor, political rehabilitation, and harsh disciplinary structures. The camps became instruments of transformation, designed not only to isolate insurgency, but to restructure allegiance and compliance. Emergency governance increasingly fused law, incarceration, and psychological control. For many Africans, the emergency became inseparable from the risk of detention. Yet, Britain's commitment to suppression cannot be understood purely through security logic. Larger national interests were at stake. National interests, why Britain fought hard. Kenya was not a peripheral possession within the British Empire. It represented economic, strategic, and symbolic value. The settler economy formed one critical pillar. European settlers controlled prime agricultural lands and export industries whose stability depended on secure land tenure. Mau Mau violence threatened not simply lives, but the economic architecture of settler society. The uprising also unfolded within the Cold War. Across the empire, British officials feared the global momentum of anti-colonial movements and the potential expansion of communist influence. Even in the absence of direct Soviet involvement, perception carried enormous weight. Colonial instability risked signaling geopolitical vulnerability. Beyond economics and ideology lay prestige. Kenya symbolized settler permanence, a vision of empire not as temporary administration, but as enduring occupation. Losing Kenya risked projecting imperial fragility at a moment when colonial authority was already under pressure elsewhere. Suppression thus became not merely tactical, but existential within imperial thinking. Yet wars are shaped not only by force, but by politics and narrative. Agenda hijack points, political complexity. The Mau Mau conflict unfolded within layers of political complexity that extended beyond battlefield dynamics. Internal divisions proved decisive. Colonial authorities armed loyalists, expanded home guard units, and sourced intelligence from within fractured communities. Divide and rule mechanisms intensified pre-existing societal fractures. Narrative framing became equally powerful. British portrayals emphasized images of savage terrorism and primitive cult violence. Such narratives reinforced domestic and international legitimacy for harsh countermeasures. Yet the underlying reality remained far more complex. An anti-colonial insurgency entangled with civil conflict and structural grievance. Moderate Kenyan nationalist leaders found themselves sidelined. Detained, restricted, or politically constrained, constitutional reform movements struggled to operate within the emergency's securitized landscape. Ironically, Mau Mau, though later marginalized within elite politics, helped radicalize the broader independence trajectory. As repression deepened, the conflict entered a prolonged military phase. Military phase, guerrilla war. The forests became the insurgency's sanctuary. Within the Aberdares and Mount Kenya regions, terrain favored guerrilla mobility, ambush tactics, and dispersed command structures. Mau Mau fighters relied on asymmetry, concealment, and endurance. British response intensified accordingly. Aerial bombardment, large-scale sweeps, intelligence-driven hunts, and collective punishments defined the evolving counterinsurgency campaign. The war shifted toward attrition, a grinding contest of exhaustion, surveillance, and containment. Within this escalating struggle, one moment would carry enormous symbolic weight. Capture of Dedan Kimathi. On October 21, 1956, Dedan Kimathi was captured, wounded, exhausted, and physically diminished after years of forced warfare. His execution on February 18, 1957 marked a decisive turning point. Militarily, the insurgency weakened. Organizational cohesion fractured. Operational capacity declined. Psychologically, however, the impact proved more complex. Leaders may fall. Symbols endure. Kimathi's death strengthened the mythology of resistance, embedding Mau Mau within Kenya's longer narrative of struggle. Human cost, unequal losses. Casualty figures remain debated, yet patterns of asymmetry are unmistakable. British estimates placed Mau Mau fighter deaths in the tens of thousands, while civilian losses reached into the thousands. British military and settler casualties, though significant, remained far lower. The imbalance reflected structural realities. Empire possessed overwhelming firepower, surveillance capacity, and logistical superiority. The costs of war fell disproportionately on African populations. Political outcome, suppression without resolution. Despite military containment, structural change became increasingly unavoidable. Negotiations at the Lancaster House conferences signaled imperial recalibration. By December 12, 1963, Kenya achieved independence, with Jomo Kenyatta, once imprisoned during the emergency, emerging as prime minister. The paradox was striking. Mau Mau fighters had destabilized colonial rule, yet were initially marginalized within post-independence politics. Memory and legitimacy remained contested. History, however, did not remain static. Long-term legacy. Over time, Mau Mau's image transformed. Once branded terrorists, fighters increasingly came to be recognized as freedom figures within Kenyan historical consciousness. A profound shift occurred in 2013. The British government reached a settlement compensating survivors and acknowledging abuses committed during the emergency. The decision marked a significant historical reversal, reshaping narratives of empire and responsibility. Why the Mau Mau Uprising matters. The significance of Mau Mau extends far beyond Kenya. Colonial Kenya became a laboratory for modern counterinsurgency, detention systems, population control mechanisms, psychological warfare strategies. Techniques later echoed across other conflicts within and beyond the empire. At its core, Mau Mau exposed a central tension of colonial rule, empire versus land, dignity, and legitimacy. It also shattered the myth of peaceful decolonization. Kenya's path to independence was violent, contested, and deeply traumatic. Closing reflection. Mau Mau was never merely a rebellion. It was a struggle over legitimacy, land, identity, and the authority to define justice and order. Like many anti-colonial wars, it reshaped not only the colony, but the empire that fought to retain it. And its echoes continue to inform how history understands resistance, power, and memory. If this episode has been of value, please subscribe, like, and share.